Hello, everybody. Welcome to a new episode of the Dissenter. I'm your host, as always, Ricardo Lopes, and today I'm joined by Dr. Jared Rubin. He's professor of economics and co-director of the Institute for the Study of Religion, Economics and Society at Chapman University. And today we're focusing on his book that he wrote together with Dr. Mark Koyama, How the World Became Rich, the Historical Origins of Economic Growth. So, Dr. Rubin, welcome to the show. It's a big pleasure to have you on.
It's a pleasure to be here. Thanks for having me.
So, just to contextualize things a little bit and for people to get an idea of what we're talking about here, how rich is the world now compared to any other point in history?
Yeah, so this is actually the book's title, "How the World Became Rich," would make
Right.
I can be interpreted many ways.
Yeah.
By rich, I don't really mean rich in the way we might think of somebody that's wealthy today
Mhm.
relative to the rest of society as being rich. I mean rich relative to nearly all of our ancestors. So a large proportion of people that lived prior to, say, 250, 300 years ago lived relatively close to subsistence. Unless you were one of the small fraction of elites in most populations, that would have been less than 10% of the population, and many even less than 5%. You were always a harvest or a bad harvest or two away from utter disaster. We might say that on average, it's something in U.S. dollars between $3 and $5 a day would have been the maximum that most people would have had in most societies. By almost any metric, most parts of the world are rich relative to that. Even countries that we now consider to be middle income, or frankly, even some countries that are developing, are relatively better off. And not only in terms of what we economists might kind of amorphously call per capita GDP or something like that. It's a nice metric, but it's only one of many. We can think of a whole host of metrics that are associated more so with quality of life that are much better today, and I think uncontroversially better than anything most of our ancestors would have had. Something like life expectancy, for instance, I believe, as of a few years ago, at least, the country with the lowest life expectancy in the world was in the low 50s, something like 51, 52 years old. Most countries in the world, it's at least 60 years, and for many, it's at least 70, and some it's even 80. This is something that, if you look even, say, 300 years ago, the wealthiest country in the world with the longest life expectancy was probably England at around 38 years. This had a lot to do with a lot of children dying. If you made it to 15, you were one of the lucky ones. This is something, so child mortality is way, way, way down. We certainly have advances in medicine and science to thank for this, but this is also an outcome of better economic conditions, the better of sanitation that comes along with it. It's a whole host of things. We know heights are people are taller now than they used to be, which is indicative of better nutrition. These are things that I think that some of them are quantifiable, some are not, but I think they're kind of incontrovertibly better. In terms of we are a richer society, and by that I mean the world society, than we've ever been. And I think, to nip something in the bud immediately, we're Mark, my co-author in this book, and I are, of course, very, very aware that not everyone in the contemporary world is rich by any metric, but even by historical standards. There are some countries, for instance, in sub-Saharan Africa, that are still around $2 to $3 a day in per capita GDP. That is very, very poor. And part of the reason we wrote this book is precisely because we can learn from history to understand at least how some societies became rich in certain contexts. And knowing what actually happened is probably our best key to unlocking riches for the remaining billion plus people.
But before we get into how that happened and where that happened, Could you tell us what exactly is economic growth? Because I mean, we're talking about economic growth all the time on the news and on social
Sure.
media and all of that, but I'm not completely sure if we understand, and by we I mean people who are not economists, understand what economic growth means exactly and how it is measured.
Yeah, so there's a few things that are in your question here because it is kind of subtle. So measure, we can start with measurement. There's several ways that the ideas we have on how to measure this, and none of them are perfect, to be clear. So we can think of per capita GDP, gross domestic product, as probably that's certainly the most commonly used metric for the overall, or certainly the overall income of a country. In fact, it's defined as the overall income of a country, which we can think of as total income made by individuals in a country plus government expenditures and net exports. Um, that is something that has long been used as within economics as a way to think about at any point in time a country's income. But growth is a little different than that. It's not just a measure of income. One thing that's really important to understand with economic growth, and really, and this is important historically as well, is that growth is something that's sustained. So it's a sustained increase in something like gross domestic product. It's not just, because plenty of countries can grow one off, even for a couple decades at a time. But if that growth reverses, we don't consider that growth. In fact, most of human history, we saw these kind of efflorescences that actually, frankly, could even last up to a century or so. And you might say that was some short run growth. But in most of these cases, whether it be through population growth, pestilence, warfare, these societies would typically eventually fall back to at some point to near subsistence-ish wages. So the key thing with growth, and again, we'll get into, I'm sure, the many ways that growth might occur, but the key thing is that we see a sustained and persistent increase in we could call it total income. We could call it well, and certainly not wealth, but yeah, total income, I think, would be a way of thinking about it. And I think one other thing too is many of the listeners might have heard the concept of economic development. That's slightly distinguished from what we're considering to be growth. So development has much more to do with kind of the structure of the economy changing, typically away from predominance of agriculture towards more manufacturing, or even in the modern day, more service sector. These two things are highly associated because typically to get long run economic growth, there needs to be some degree of development happening, but they are different things. And in the end, it's the growth that we care about because it's the growth that can lead to an improvement in the quality of life for most people.
So, in trying to understand how sustained economic growth happened and happens, there are many different people that put different hypotheses on the table and talk about many different factors. For example, in the book, you go through geography, politics, institutions, markets and states, culture, human capital, demography, and colonization, for example. So, starting with geography. What do people that talk about geography argue exactly?
Yeah, so there's several different types of geographical hypotheses. Probably the most famous one is Jared Diamond's one, the one he put forth in Guns, Germs, and Steel, which had been based on, there was a previous literature that argued similar things. So he argued for a few things that are, we would certainly think of as geography based. For instance, the way that the continents, for instance, are formulated, whether they're kind of more north-south as the Americas are and sub-Saharan Africa is, or east-west more so as Eurasia is. So his idea is that east-west, the continents that are east-west, because they're on similar latitudes, ideas can travel quicker, grains, livestock, because there is similar climates. You get much more spread throughout these areas, whereas so the idea of something traveling from, say, North America to South America in a pre-industrial world you'd have to go through a series of different climates, from mountainous to tropical to back to mountainous. that you are much less likely to see spread, and it's not just spread of, again, it's not just spread of ideas, even though that matters. It's, or the spread of even human populations. Probably more importantly, it's the spread of domesticable animals and grains. And this is one idea that he also puts forth. Associated with this is you see a lot more of the big domesticated animals are in Eurasia, not in other parts of the world. This helped lead to early societies growing, and thus, Eurasia being the place where you were more likely to see economic development. I think you should just preface everything by saying, one thing that the book does is, it does put forward these arguments and just say, kind of explain what they are. The first half does, and then it tries to bring them together, especially the ones that we think have a little more explanatory power, and think about how they interact with each other. There are other geographic arguments, so things like climate, whether that be temperature or really disease climate has been a big one, and particularly for trying to explain, at least partially explain, the relative economic backwardness of sub-Saharan Africa. You have this giant malaria belt, yellow fever, that does make work conditions hard. It makes trade it makes it much harder to trade, especially with outsiders who might not have built up as much immunity to these diseases as others. Then there's, concepts of ruggedness would be another thing, how rugged the terrain is. So, kind of mountainous, and that has a couple consequences. Rugged terrain is typically harder to farm. So those places that are in rugged terrain, might have had, and in fact, it has been shown, have had historically lower population densities. Perhaps more importantly for economic development, it's also harder to trade, because overland trade with places that are mountainous is just harder to get to and bring goods of high value to. So that would be kind of the flavor. There's other things as well, like soil quality, access to rivers and sea. There's some famous theses that the fact that England was an island helped protect it. There's access to coal. When we get to the Industrial Revolution, that we say was certainly was a necessary condition for England at least to industrialize the way it did. It's unclear that it explains everything, as I'm sure we will get to, but these are things that are so one last thing about geography-based explanations is that on the one hand they are satisfying because there's nothing else that might be explaining geography, and for the most part, it's not, with the exception of things like climate change, things like this, most of the geography is just there. So it kind of, it's not like something like culture or something like institutions, which have their own causes. Geography is just kind of there. So we can say, all right, this is, to use the lingo of economics, it's exogenous. It's, it's from the outside. The downside, as I'm sure we'll discuss, of explanations that purely rely on geography is they have a really hard time explaining reversal of fortunes, which is what we have certainly seen. So northwestern Europe, we know, for instance, is where the first modern economy took off. It was one of the poorest parts of Eurasia 1,000 years ago. So this is something that it's really hard to account for both those facts by just the geography of the two places. But as I'm sure we'll talk about, geography does interact with other features, which does leave some room for geography to play a role in why certain parts of the world became rich earlier than others, and why others have since followed in their footsteps.
And the fact that you just mentioned that geography can interact with other features, let me ask you this. So where would you place, in terms of the several different explanations people put out there, where would you place technology? Do you think it is part of geography-based explanations, or, for example, culture-based explanations?
Yeah, I think it's certainly, my take would be it's not a geography-based explanation. I think there's very few geographic features that make most types of technological progress likely to happen in one area versus another. I think technology has much more to do with a society's institutions. So, as society's institutions help form incentives for everything, for all types of actions, including the incentive to innovate, but also to adopt technologies. So both those things are incredibly important. There have been some recent theories, particularly on Britain's industrialization, that claim that culture played a role, especially Enlightenment culture. And I think that those theories are somewhat convincing. Again, one thing that I think might already be coming clear is that we don't think there's one answer. There's no one silver bullet. A lot of the big questions have many, many answers. But I think your question is very appropriate. Just because there's many answers doesn't mean we just throw up our hands and say we know nothing. We can actually classify some of these answers and say, well, what might have more weight? And in terms of innovation or technological change, geography doesn't play much of a role. I don't think so. Demography is another thing that we have a whole chapter on, births and deaths, and because demography played an incredibly important role in the pre-industrial economy, because it dictated essentially, as people had some excess income, they just had more children. Those children would eat up the excess income. But I bring this up here to say I don't think that had a huge role in technological development either. Only except to the extent that we should think of technological development as being a bit random, as being especially new major inventions, and it sometimes requires a stroke of genius. So the bigger the population you have, and there's a fairly large literature on this, it just suggests the more people you have that are able to devote their mental resources to things like innovation, meaning they're not looking for food, they're not just on the farm working all day, the more likely it is that you will have innovation in a society. And that's something that is much more, it's partly demographic. It's also partly, again, institutional, because it follows from growth. So I think, back to the original question, one thing we will talk about, I'm sure, is innovation and technological change. It's among the most important reasons for the rise of the modern economy. I don't think that, at least in a direct way, geography played a big role, maybe indirectly through its effect on some things like institutions.
So you mentioned institutions there. What are some of the ones that people tend to focus on the most when trying to explain economic growth?
Very good. Yeah. So so when we talk institutions more broadly, it can mean a lot of things. It can mean religious institutions, political, legal, even social institutions. One of the biggest ones that there's a very large literature on in both economics and political science is political institutions. So, something like constraints on executive power, reducing the level of autocracy in a society, having more buy-in from a larger portion of the population because they have some say in governance, ends up mattering more so, I would say more so for not necessarily for spurring on economic growth, but for not stopping it, if that makes sense. So a place like China, for instance, was more or less since the fall of the Roman Empire in the 5th century, for the next 1,000 years, probably the leading area in Eurasia in terms, maybe with the exception of parts of the Middle East after the spread of Islam, in terms of technological development, probably per capita GDP, even though everyone was kind of poor in this time, and even culturally when we think of stuff like architecture and things like that. But in the case of China, you had kind of persistently autocratic institutions, very centralized government with very few checks on executive power, especially relative to what would happen in parts of Europe much later, in say the 17th, 18th, 19th centuries. And we view that, and I certainly do. I think I can speak for Mark on this one too. I think he would agree that that this was less so a reason why why northwestern Europe pulled ahead, but it was definitely one of the reasons why China didn't. If that makes sense, because what autocratic power can do is can be arbitrary. Rights are not always necessarily secure, even if an autocrat claims that they're going to protect rights, they can renege at any point. And even if they're for some reason, perfectly honest, their successor might not be. Things like this certainly decrease incentive to invest. They decrease incentive to innovate on many margins. So that would be among the most important institutions, certainly bundled with political institutions or legal institutions, those that help punish those that and adjudicate what things when things go wrong. Having those types of institutions be relatively unbiased and relatively open to everyone in in a consistent way. So, the elites don't get preferential treatment, as more or less has been the case in most societies and for most of humanity, at least since we settled down into communities.
Mm-hmm.
These are the types of things that encourage greater economic interaction, because that if you get cheated, you're gonna, the person will get punished. If you think that the person can get away completely free after cheating you, you're much less likely to engage with them. So those would be the big ones. There's been some work, including stuff that both I and Mark have done independently, that have suggested that religious institutions can also have, at least in my own work, in terms of, say, medieval Europe and medieval Middle East, can play a dampening role on economic development. There's some indications that, in other contexts, it might play a positive role as well. But I would say that these are the biggest institutional features, and they're also ones that, just to kind of preview what we argue later in the book. Institutions are we view as among the most important factors in why certain parts of the world became rich, but also, I think, even more importantly, why certain parts of the world were then able to catch up and other parts have not been.
Mm-hmm. And what about culture? What are some of the aspects of culture that people usually reference, and what are the ones you think could play the biggest role?
Great. Yeah. So, I mean, it certainly matters the question we're asking here in terms of if it's technological change, for instance. So, the economic historian Joel Mokyr, who, for my money, is maybe the best out there right now, wrote a book a few years ago arguing that the British Industrial Revolution was in part due to this kind of pan-European cultural change that came along with the Enlightenment, that really kind of changed the way people did science and the way they viewed science. So, this idea that science could be something that led to the progress of mankind, that actually had, and then this trickled, according to Mokyr, trickled down to, say, artisans, which were in abundance in England or Britain at the time. And this idea then that, technological change was something that could happen and could regularly happen, and it was something that was fundamentally new to humanity, really. And I think there's a good case to be made there that this is something that came about, at least beginning in elite circles during the Enlightenment, that then did spread to the rest of society. And having this type of mindset, so when we talk about culture, and actually I think it's worth prefacing this, as we do in the book, by saying, there are very nasty cultural theories as well. In the early 20th century, there were several, the major theories, I would say, were highly Eurocentric in terms of, there's just something about European culture that is not, say, in Chinese culture or South Asian culture. And that's why Europe is richer. And that's why Europe has this giant, or various European countries have this giant colonial enterprise. And these, I think Eurocentric is probably the most generous way of describing them. Many were just flat out racist. Mm-hmm. And that is not what we're talking about when we're talking about cultural explanations. So there's been a resurgence in research in culture, I think, really led by cultural anthropologists in the last few decades, really going back to the 80s with the work of Boyd and Richardson. And what they mean by culture is, we think about it as the lens through which people view the world, how they take inputs from the outside world and in their mind make them into outputs, into thinking through the way the world works. And we call this culture because it's typically something that is societal. It's not something that one just gets on their own. It's something that societies typically have shared views on how the world works. And when we think about how, a group that has a shared class of mental models, we would consider that a culture. And, I think when we think about it this way, we can see why culture could matter for economic development if how you see the world is, and see the same phenomena in the world is very different from the way I see it, at least, how A causes B, then we would expect, you and me, but also more importantly, our cultures to have very different ways of viewing the world. It's probably going to bleed into very different types of institutions, whether they be political, economic, legal, things like this, which also may cause cultural differences, which is, as you might already be able to tell, this is where some of these arguments can get a little messy in terms of figuring out what causes what. But that's what we mean by culture. And I think, so when we think about, back to your original question on what type of culture matters, certainly attitudes toward technological change, attitudes towards progress, those things matter. So I already mentioned religion. Briefly, religion is the type of thing that I think matters and can matter in many ways. Religion, I would argue, is certainly part of culture. The society's certainly, if a society has a predominant religion, it's part of its culture. And the main way that religion matters, at least and this is where I think one of these interactions can really help explain, is not so much in doctrine itself. It's not so much that most religions, whether even the big religions, Christianity, Islam, Buddhism, most of them aren't necessarily anti-economic. Most of them aren't pro-economic either. They're just kind of, they're guides on how to live, what is viewed as a moral life, like this. But one thing that does come about and has come about in most societies where religion is important is that religion ends up playing a big role in politics. Because religion is very useful for political authorities as a way of gaining legitimacy, getting people to pay taxes, and some degree of control. And when religion plays a role in politics, that means that other groups don't play a role, have a weaker role in politics, especially those with economic interests. And this is something that I've pushed, and others have kind of had similar ideas on, that this is one of those ways that culture, and in this case specifically religion, can play a role in economic development. Again, not so much through the cultural norms or the religious doctrine itself, but the way that it affects the society's political and economic institutions.
So you mentioned something there that I would like to get more into. I had
Sure.
this question saved for a bit later before we got into colonization hypotheses and explanations. But at a certain point there, when talking about culture, you mentioned, for example, particularly in the early 20th century, how people came up with cultural superiority explanations, some of them associated with race. And I mean, as far as I know, when people claim that there might be there are aspects of culture that might be innate to specific races. I mean, I've talked with anthropologists and other people on the show, and as far as I'm aware, that's just nonsense. So, but anyway, to ask you a sort of different question, but also related to that, is there any explanation of economic growth that has to do with racial or ethnic homogeneity that has any support whatsoever?
Yes. So typically, a big finding of, that's been shown in several contexts is that it's kind of the other, I guess it's kind of the other way. So ethnic fractionalization is typically negatively related to economic growth, both across countries and within countries. Mm-hmm. And the idea there being that ethnically fractionalized societies, all that's just a kind of a term for how distinct different ethnic groups are within one state. Those societies are typically a little harder to run politically because you have different groups with vastly different interests in some cases. And this is just the idea put forth in the literature. This is not something I or Mark have really done any work on, but there is some support for that this is the case. And typically the mechanism that's proposed is that politics becomes more contentious, less gets done. And you also have the capacity, there's some good work done in sub-Saharan Africa because after the scramble for Africa in the late 19th century, you get these different ethnic groups that are placed that have historically been rivals, maybe even enslaved each other back in the slavery period, that are now in the same country, and they would have never been part of the same governance before, and they typically have animosity towards each other. And there's been some very good studies, one by Mikolopoulos and Papuanu, that suggested that in those places where you have different ethnic groups in the same in the same country, but also when you have overlapping groups across countries, you get a lot more civil wars, you get a lot more domestic violence. By domestic violence, I mean, between ethnic groups within the same country.
Mm-hmm.
You even get more cross-country wars by groups that have ethnic groups in two different countries. One might be protecting the other one, say if they're the majority in one and the minority in the other, things like this. So there is some evidence that at least fractionalization can hamper economic growth. Just quickly to preview what we'll say here is, I mean, I think it's very hard to then make that claim that's why, say, Britain took off. China was also pretty ethnically homogenous and did not. But yeah, I mean, there is some evidence.
Mm-hmm. Right. What about explanations that focus on demographics? So what tend to be the factors that people bring to the table?
So demographic explanations, by far the most famous one is a very old one of Thomas Malthus, who in 1798 proposed this theory, which actually did a pretty decent job at explaining much of humankind, or to human economic systems prior to when he was writing. Ironically, he was writing in Britain during the Industrial Revolution, with the thing that would eventually, even to be clear, Britain's Industrial Revolution begins in the late 18th century. The economic takeoff, especially in terms of per capita GDP and wages, doesn't really happen until the 19th century. But what his explanation was, and it's if you've taken, hopefully if you've taken an economics class, or certainly if you've taken an economic history class, this is something you might be somewhat familiar with. It's known as the Malthusian theory that as a society that society's base level is near subsistence. You can't really go below subsistence or people start dying. But if you have some type of say shock, some type of outside event, whether it be technological change, it might be a warfare, it might be an epidemic. So an epidemic that kills off a lot of people. The survivors actually, for at least some period after the Black Death, it was over a century, typically have higher incomes because you have a major shock to labor supply. Over time, what happens is even when you get these increases in income, people end up having more children, and as you have more children, they end up starting to eat into that surplus, and people only really stop when you have per capita incomes back to close to subsistence. So the idea, according to these theories, is that through much of human history, you would get, when you got technological growth, what it would end up in the long run would be greater population density, but not greater overall income per capita. And this actually goes back to your very first question, one of the first questions, what is growth?
Mm-hmm.
The difference between what we're talking about here and growth is remember, growth is sustained. So the idea behind the Malthusian theory, and this was true prior to say 1800 or so, is that no economy really grew fast enough and continued that in a sustained way to overcome these demographic features. And you can say there's still plenty of countries at least the poorest countries in the world today still exhibit Malthusian dynamics. And, I think we're even to some degree, even though, many parts of sub-Saharan Africa are now at least away from the very margins of subsistence, over the next, say, 50 years, we're going to see massive population growth by every estimate I've seen in this region, which is somewhat consistent with at least the beginnings of Malthusian growth. And it's only when, then you start to see, so a big explanation to, kind of fully answer your question and the role that demography can play in long run growth is what is known as a demographic transition. So this is what, much of the wealthy, really all of the wealthy world has gone through today, where instead of averaging 6-7 children per woman, families, women typically now only have 2 to 3 children at most. And say on parts of Western Europe, you're in Portugal, it's very much happening on the Iberian Peninsula for sure. It's actually much less than that, where we're actually below replacement. A place like Japan has been well below replacement for decades now. So this is something that the idea is that it's once you get this transition away, towards much lower birth rates, it ends up being much lower birth rates and much lower death rates as well. So as you do this, people typically end up living longer lives as well. That's when you can really start to see growth. because you no longer have these population pressures pushing down on income whenever you get some type of event that allows for per capita income to grow. So I think that, much like some of the other stuff we've been saying, I think it's very clear that this type of demographic change is necessary for long run per capita income, really to really affect most of society. Again, historically, elites have always been wealthy. I mean, as I've been describing, I said, it's only been the last few hundred years where we get away from some close to subsistence. Of course, back in the medieval period, Roman period, even before, the very small portion of the population was able to extract most of the rents of society, and by the standards of the day and the technology of the day, lived nicely. On the other hand, to get what most of us actually care about is getting that wealth that's created to the rest of the population. Having some degree of demographic change has been shown to matter. And again, it really can't be the whole thing explaining why certain parts of Europe took off. In fact, because it was actually France that had its demographic transition before anywhere else, and France was certainly not the place where economic growth first took off. But it's also hard to imagine a place like Britain growing as it did without having some degree of decline in birth rates.
Mm-hmm. So getting into colonization then, did colonization really have a big impact on the economic growth of the colonizer countries?
So this is a very good question. It's very contentious,
Yeah.
and I don't think we have. I would say, I mean, Mark and I have our own read on the literature. I would say so let's say that Mark and I end up writing a second edition of this in 10 years. I think this is the question that we would be by far the most willing. I mean, well, we're willing to entertain any evidence that's contrary to anything in the book if it comes out. But I think this is the one where we might see much more evidence one way or the other. And obviously, I'm happy to go with whatever the way the evidence takes us, because this is something where so within the discipline of history, so not just purely economic history, there's a whole new literature known as the history of capitalism that makes this claim that colonization really did play a role in the early, what they call the early capitalism, but really, Britain's takeoff, whether that be through, especially through the mainly the North American colonies, and actually even more so those in the Caribbean, where you have sugar coming in, where you eventually in the southern U.S. you have the slave plantation economy that was producing all the cotton that ended up being so important for the British textile mills.
Yeah.
And of course, slavery plays a gigantic role in this whole process. There's been a lot of other research done suggesting that while clearly. And I should also preface this by saying no one in this literature or actually, I shouldn't even say that. Almost everyone in this literature is not claiming that colonization was good for the most people, and certainly the enslaved. There are a few, and to be clear, they are outliers that think that especially British colonization brought civilization to different parts of the world. Those are the types of explanations that fall much more in line with those explanations I noted at the beginning that are more early 20th century in their mindset. So we don't even need to talk about those, and we don't talk about those in the book because that's a very intentional omission, because we think that those are silly. The work done by historians of capitalism, though, are much more, in a sense, I would say, not just thoroughly researched, but there is a cogent argument there. And there's also plenty of counter arguments that say, look, if you look at how Britain industrialized, much of the financing did not come from, say, the colonies. It came from London and enterprises that were based in different types of trade. So I think that in terms of the role that colonization played on the way that Britain industrialized, and especially when we think about, well, why did Britain industrialize? It was mainly technology. The links are relatively weak, even though they are there. And again, I think that this is something that over the next, say, 10, 15 years, we're going to get a lot better understanding of just how important those links are. In fact, there's been a couple papers that have come out in the last year, since we wrote this book, that have made somewhat convincing arguments, and these are by economics and economists and economic historians, that we can see some direct, causal links between certain aspects of the colonial enterprise and, particularly products of slave plantations and what was going on even in British textile manufacturing. One thing that we do in the book, though, and I know this isn't exactly your question, but I do think it's important, is to say, look, even if colonization might have played, it's played a most disputable role in Britain's industrialization, and even then in the spread of industrialization, in the 19th century to other parts of Western Europe, eventually to East Asia. One thing that the literature is much less, I'd say much less controversial, is that it has played a really dampening role on those that were colonized in terms of catching up. Now, most of the places that were colonized, by the time you get to, say, the 17th or 18th century, were probably not going to be the places where a big economic takeoff would have happened. By that point, northwestern Europe is not looking like a terrible candidate for a huge economic takeoff. That said, in really what's much more important in terms of the spread of growth worldwide, there's been plenty of evidence that it's come out in the last 20 years, looking at the formerly colonized world, that various aspects of colonization really dampened growth even after independence. Whether it be via the institutions that colonists implanted, it might be through cultural change, and something like, for instance, slavery has really been shown to have affected culture in sub-Saharan Africa, especially things like trust and trust of others, which we think of as incredibly important for economic development to happen. So I think, on that margin, the literature is less. It's less controversial. It's a much less controversial statement to say that there was the catch up in many, though obviously not all parts of the formerly colonized world, has been much slower. I mean, obviously, I'm speaking to you from the United States, one of the wealthiest countries in the world that was, a former colony. So there is significant differences in the formerly, colonized world, which, to be clear, is most of the landmass in the entire world. But in those places that remain poor, we do see some colonial legacy there for sure.
Mm-hmm. So the question I'm about to ask you now, you've already touched a little bit on it in this previous question, but I think it's very important to address it because, this is extremely contentious, and particularly because many people who debate it come from a place where they are very politically motivated, and so, but when it comes to the impact that colonization had on the colonized countries. Because there are people that claim that because European countries particularly introduced some institutions like political and legal institutions, some technology, some cultural practices, etc., into what are now the countries they colonize, that even though there was slavery and exploitation of all kinds, in the end, they ended up contributing somewhat to the economic growth and development of these countries. But is that really clear or not?
Yeah, I don't think it's clear. I think it goes case by case. Really, what many of these. So I think in terms of the degree to which that specific colonial past contributed to the economic growth of the countries. There's been some famous studies, some of which have since been looked at as maybe not exaggerating claims, but certainly looking at from different angles has not always been shown to be completely robust. Is the different types of institutions that get implanted afterwards. There in many contexts have been shown to say, look, if you have the types of institutions that are highly extractive, those that were put in there in order to either take gold and silver which was a big thing in, say, South American colonies, particularly the Spanish ones, or to extract things like sugarcane, which might have taken a certain type of labor, particularly really strenuous labor. Those types of institutions, like the type of institutions you need for those, consolidate power in a small group of people, and it really requires coercive power, much more so than, say, places where you have settled groups that might try to bring with them some type of representative institutions. And it really requires also coercive power over locals, the natives that had been there previously. Now, one thing that I do think has certainly been shown in some contexts, at least, is that those types of institutions are very attractive to those people that are in power even after independence. You have people, locals, that have gained power through these institutions. They're the most likely to then be able to, after independence, kind of move institutions, move politics in their favor. And they become the elites based on this. And typically we think of those types of extractive institutions, not surprisingly, as not being great for growth. So I do think there are margins. And again, it does very much matter the context you're talking about. And really, that's, I think, one of the themes of the book, is that, there's no silver bullets. And it's a comment I've already said, and we say it a few times in the book. What we do have to be very kind of aware of the certain cultural and institutional context in which we're talking about. And in some cases, you might see certain legacies mattering, and in some cases not. But again, I think this is one where we do see it mattering in many different contexts.
Mm-hmm. So, having gone through all of these kinds of explanations, what do you think is the best way of thinking about them? I mean, as causes or explanations, looking at different factors like demographics, culture, institutions, and so on. So, how should we think about them? How to combine them together, perhaps in particular contexts?
Yeah, no, and this is really one of the reasons we wrote this book. So maybe I'll give you a couple seconds of background. When we started talking about this book, I think maybe 2015 or 16, we on the one hand noted that, we both teach this type of stuff in our classes. There was no book out there that really went over, that gave a broad synthesis of this rapidly growing literature. On the other hand, and that would be more kind of from a textbook perspective. But one thing we wanted to make a positive contribution as well, not just kind of overview everything out there. And really, one thing that academic publishing incentivizes, and I certainly don't blame the authors of these many works who I've learned much from, but they really incentivize making one strong claim. And in doing so, whether it be in articles or books, you don't get as much of the interaction between claims. You think, all right, well, in a big question like how did the world become rich, we know that's not monocausal. And we know that there's many factors, some of which interact with each other, some of which work separately in tandem with each other, some of which are only important in some contexts and not the others, that matter. And one thing we try to do in this book, to get at your question, is to think about how some of these different features, whether they begin to be institutions, culture, demography, et cetera, interact with each other to really kind of increase the power of the explanation that we have in mind. So, we do think, for instance, you brought up geography as one of the first, was one of the first questions you asked me. And I say, well, a downside of geographic explanations is they don't really explain reversals well. Well, one thing that geography does, we know, play an important role in is it does help shape the types of institutions that a society has. So a trivial one that we mentioned in the book, for instance, is, you're not likely to have a corpus of maritime law in a landlocked country. That's obvious. It doesn't really matter, but it just gives you an example of why different countries might have very different types of institutions. And this is something that when we think about even something like ruggedness or, access to trade, things like this, a country like Britain, which was, it's an island and thus had very, a very different historical past that was in part due to its geography. you end up getting different types of the highest level laws, but I think undergirding this is it can bleed into just the types of institutions you have. So, for instance, a place like China, there's an argument made. In fact, Mark, the co-author in this book, has contributed significantly to this literature that looks at, well, in China you have a threat coming from one direction. And this really increases, this is very much a geographic argument because it's the steppe. It's this giant expanse that, the Mongols and many other different steppe groups, inhabited, more or less from almost the Pacific Ocean all the way to Eastern Europe.
Mm-hmm.
And his argument, and made with co-authors and has been similarly made by others, is that this led to centralization in China because you had to have this kind of centralized power, especially based in the north, that could push off this threat. Whereas, in Europe, you have threats coming from all angles, especially after the fall of the Roman Empire. You have Vikings coming from the north. You have Magyars and Muslims coming from the southeast and south, and you end up getting several different states because of it. This is very much, now we're getting into the realm of institutions, how politics are organized, how different groups might have different types of power. We can also say something I mentioned before where, because of this in China, you might get more tendency towards autocracy because of this. And again, so this would be an idea that, all right, it's the politics that ends up mattering for economic development, but we can see some of the roots of the politics and the types of political institutions a society has, and probably more importantly, why different societies have different institutional setups. In some cases, geography plays a role in this. So I think that's a crystal clear example, at least in my mind, of the way that these various factors can interact with each other. I would also say that, and I think our biggest takeaway from the book is that institutions and culture really strongly interact with each other. So for instance, in a society where you have cultural norms that put people that do labor in kind of the lowest of classes, the ideal cult, according, and this was, say, true in the Roman Empire, the ideal was once you became rich, you'd go retire and live in a villa and live a life of luxury, rather than, hard work being something that was viewed as a positive. This then we say, all right, well, that's certainly a cultural norm that might matter. And there's been a few economic historians that suggest that this is among the more important cultural norms that matters, but this is also then ends up, being both affecting and affected by society's institutions, whether it be the type of, financing that can occur that is necessary for funding innovation, or just, the types of, incentive structures more generally that encourage innovation. These are all interwoven, I think, in really important ways. And I'd say probably maybe the most important takeaway from our book, as certainly one of them, is that if you consider either the institutions or the culture, for the sake of this example, in isolation, you don't really get the full story. Mm-hmm. Once you consider these factors, and then you apply it to the specific historical settings, then you start to understand, I think, a little better why some societies were able to take off, why others maybe have been stagnating. I think one final example on this that might be a little clearer to the listener, and it became clear to me in living through it in, say, the early 2000s. You had a failure of spread of democracy. The U.S. and allies tried to, more or less spread democracy by force. You also see this, very similar thing happening after the fall of the Soviet Union in terms of transitioning to capitalism. It succeeded in some parts that were behind the Iron Curtain, and failed miserably in other parts, even in Russia, where, it ended up just leading to cronyism and eventually, the rise of a strongman. And you see that in the Central Asian states as well. This is something where I think, we really see an interaction between institutions and culture, going back to, the failure of, spread of democracy. Democracy is not just a set of institutions. It's not just we have rules for how voting happens, and, the winner of an election, whether it be a parliamentary or presidential system, when those institutions matter, for sure, and how democracy plays out, and how the rules of society are kind of both created and then either persist or not.
Yeah.
But things like democratic norms matter, right? That there's a widespread belief that the election is fair and free, and that votes count and matter. These are things that, especially in places like the former Soviet Union, or in a place like Saddam's Iraq, that those norms had been anything like those norms had been so crushed by the previous regimes that they don't exist. And when they don't exist, all those institutions don't matter, in a sense. They're not going to work the way that they work in other parts of the world. So that's kind of what we mean. I think that hopefully that's a clearer example of how a society's culture can affect the way that institutions work, and also why, again, to use that term, there's no silver bullet. It's not like we can say, all right, well, if you just have democracy, you're gonna grow. No, that's not the case. In fact, democracy is not even going to work the way it works in, say the U.S. or Portugal, or other parts of the world, in certain societies with different cultural norms.
Mm-hmm. So I have 2 or 3 more topics I would like to go
Sure.
through, and since we've already explored all of the different explanations that people usually bring to the table, let's apply all of that to try to understand how sustained economic growth was possible in northwestern Europe,
Okay.
particularly, and also how the British Industrial Revolution happened.
Yeah.
So.
Sure.
What are the preconditions you think were the most important here?
Yeah, it's great. So I think it's relatively uncontroversial to say that economic growth first took off in northwestern Europe. Certainly industrialization at a massive scale happened first in Britain. Well, I use the term northwestern Europe because the Dutch Republic really did have a florescence beginning in the late 16th century, that where this very small country, both in terms of geography and population, for about 100, 150 years was the richest country in the world. Trade was really important, but politics ended up being an important driver of this. It didn't really have a king, especially once it threw off Spanish rule. It was kind of ruled mainly by the economic elites and their parliaments. And because of this, you start to see especially in the late 16th and 17th centuries, in the Dutch case, you see a host of policies that really do improve economic growth. Things like really strong protection of property rights, investments in massive public good projects, like more or less a third of the country's underwater. This is a period where a lot of that land is reclaimed. These are things that did lead to the growth of the Dutch Republic. I'd say for the most part, though, a lot of these were not replicable in many other parts of the world. The fact that the Dutch were small certainly helped with this. And you mentioned this before, homogeneity, especially among a small population, helps. Moving to Britain, though, where we really start to see a growth in technological change in the late 18th century. There's been a whole host of different explanations for this, and this is certainly something that's over-explained at this point. We think that so among the most important, we'll say preconditions, so that's what we call it in the book, are first off, relatively limited governance. So what we mean by that is that it's certainly the Parliament of the 18th century was still could be very corrupt, still could certainly favor localized projects and localized spending over things that were good for the broader country. But we also see a relatively less powerful sovereign in England after, say, 1689, after the Glorious Revolution, possibly even after, to some degree, after the civil wars of the mid 17th century, where again, it's not so much that's the thing that triggered the Industrial Revolution or a subsequent growth in the 19th century, but one thing it really did, in our view, and I think the view of many in this literature, is that it didn't put the brakes on it either. Again, so I mentioned China as, I think, kind of the counterexample to this. You do see cases where the centralized, the emperor of a centralized regime really just stopped growth, what could have been growth, in its tracks. When you have power that's much more dispersed, it's much harder to do that. So again, that's one of the preconditions that we think of as being somewhat necessary. I already mentioned the work of Moikir before. I do think that, and this is something that's pan-European, but, having this kind of cultural change towards where, at least among elites and then spreading throughout the population, where you do have some idea that progress is both attainable and desirable. I think it's hard to imagine modern economic growth happening without having at least some notion that's the case. Again, not something that in and of itself explains it, but again, is one of these kind of constellation of conditions that we think matters. So in other work Moikir has done, and I think he has a forthcoming book out that makes his case much more transparent, even though for your listeners that are interested in this literature, his 2009 book, The Enlightened Economy, it's very dense, but it's amazing. It has so much, it's so jam-packed with just knowledge of this period. He makes his case that England, or Britain in particular, one thing, so this Enlightenment change, it was a pan-European cultural change. It's not something unique to Britain. So, there's no, in fact, it might have even been stronger in a place like France, where you have, your Descartes, your Diderot, some of the very leaders of the Enlightenment are French. But what you have in England, according to Moikir, and I think he's, shown this nicely, is a much larger set of skilled laborers. And there's plenty of historical reasons why this was the case. Some of it goes back to guilds and things like this. But why he claims this was important, and again, England's not the only place that has a whole lot of skilled laborers. The big cities in, say, Central Europe, the Holy Roman Empire, parts of northern Italy. I'd say to a lesser extent France, just because France, really had one massive city, Paris, and then did not have the free cities like these other places did. But one thing it did is that when you have this kind of combination of cultural change, that progress can happen, and that that either the ideas of science can then kind of creep into more kind of artisanal pursuits with a large set of people that can then implement those these changes. And really, because when we look at the first industrial revolution, which is circa, say, 1750 to 1830, it's largely led by artisans, people that were skilled with their hands, that were craftsmen. Having a large set of people like that mattered, certainly for innovation. There are plenty of other things as well. Certainly, so for a place like Britain, and Dutch as well, having access to the Atlantic, I think, clearly mattered. And that's something that also, yes, it's a geographical condition, but it's also a contingent geographic condition. Having access to the Atlantic mattered very little prior to 1500, right? In fact, it might have even been a detriment, because really, prior to 1500, almost all economic activity is happening in the Mediterranean. It's not the Atlantic that matters, at least in Europe. With the opening up of the New World, of course, you get a whole host of changes that end up really shifting the geographic center to the economic center to the Atlantic. Again, though, this is also something that can't explain everything. Spain and Portugal had access to the Atlantic as well, and while they had giant colonial enterprises, were not the first places to grow. So again, it's kind of this constellation of things. And you could also say the same. Another geographic feature is the north of England had a lot of coal, right? Coal ended up being important for the way that England, or Britain rather, ended up industrializing. That's not controversial. The quintessential invention of the Industrial Revolution is the steam engine, which ran on coal. Coal-powered engines and coal-powered energy more generally allowed for a whole host of changes in the way that the economy was structured. As the term I used before, allowed for economic development. Again, though, this is not unique to Britain. There are plenty of other places, including the Ruhr Valley. There's plenty of parts of China that had access to, and it's actually, I should say, it's not just coal. It's easy to access coal that matters. It's not having to dig deep into mines to get. It's relatively easy access, which was the case in northern England. Again, that's something that mattered as well. We also note in the book, another thing that distinguishes England, or Britain rather, from the Dutch Republic are access to large internal markets. So Britain was just bigger, and that to some degree does matter. You certainly don't need to be the size of, say, China in the period to have a large internal market, but having the capacity to produce and have a market for one's goods that does not depend on trade with potentially hostile nations does matter for incentivizing certain types of growth, especially when we think of industrial growth, manufacturing growth, things like this. So in some, that's a lot. And there's actually, we mentioned a few more in the book. These were all seemingly, for at least we can say, for the way that England industrialized, they were all necessary. Now, one thing that economists, I think, to our credit, are pretty good at are thinking about counterfactuals and think, well, let's say England didn't have one of these. Could it have industrialized differently? And for some of these, the jury's out. I mean, I think that something like politics, had England had an absolutist monarchy, had, Henry VIII, for instance, had 10 sons and wanted to continue a highly autocratic and Catholic monarchy that had persisted, I think we might be looking at a very different place. And frankly, it might not have been Britain that took off first. So this is all to say that there was nothing predetermined that it had to happen in England by any means. In fact, from the benefit of hindsight, we can say on many margins, Britain was lucky.
Mm-hmm. So, I mean, but it's very interesting to try to understand why certain places, and you mentioned a bit of that, like particularly China, which, as far as I'm aware, is probably the oldest nation in the world, and it's huge, and places like India and the Middle East, for example, why they did not achieve sustained economic growth first. Right, I mean, because they had many of those factors we talked about throughout the interview were there, right?
Sure. Yeah. No, I mean, I think China is, as you mentioned, I mean, it was unified in the second century BC, and while it's gone through some ups and downs, for the most part, even though there's been different dynasties, it's largely been, the core of it's largely been unified for almost 2,200 years. As you noted, a lot of the preconditions I noted before, such as certainly access to coal, obviously it's a huge coastline, not facing the Atlantic, but prior to 1500, who cares? In fact, it's probably, in many respects better to have access to, the Southeast Asia, and spices and also South Asia, which we know there was trade between the two, certainly, Silk Route trade, but also, overseas trade. Mm-hmm. It had, a host of skilled artisans for sure, much like Britain had. Again, one thing that we do emphasize here that we think has a lot of explanatory power on the why not China case is it was autocratic more or less the entire time. You always have a centralized ruler that has an immense amount of discretion. That it's administered by this bureaucracy that whose position is highly coveted, and because of this, they have a lot of incentive to keep the system going to their benefit, and it really does allow a large amount of discretion that ends up being a bad thing for economic growth. We could say the same thing, and this is where a lot of my own research has been on the Middle East. The Middle East was also in a situation, especially the first 300-400 years after the spread of Islam, was way ahead of any part of Western Europe, mm-hmm. in terms of any type of metric you would think right. of as being important for economic growth. Yet over time, it obviously, there was a reversal of fortunes between Western Europe and the Middle East. And again, this is something where autocratic power, we need to think of, I mean, this is only, I should say, a surface level thing. We also have to have an explanation for why autocratic power persisted in, right. say, China and the Middle East, and why it didn't in most parts of Europe. There were certainly autocracies in Europe, and there actually still are today, but wider representation became much more common in Europe. And and to be clear, there are plenty of explanations for this. This is something that is probably at one of the core of historical political economy, for instance, is trying to understand these precise questions. But I think, especially when we go to China, that's one of the big inhibiting factors. And one thing that we should say is that, look, for the way that the takeoff happened in Britain, you needed that constellation of factors for it to take off the way it did. One thing we're hoping to take from this, though, is now when we think about catch-up growth, why some countries were able to adopt afterwards, you don't need all of those factors. And in fact, it's impossible to have some of those factors, especially something, geography is just geography. If you're not going to, if you don't have coal, you don't have coal. Fortunately, you don't need coal and haven't needed coal for a very long time to adopt most of these say the innovations or the institutions, things like this. Of course, coal is also something that one can import, and now even obviously in the 21st century, we're no longer a coal-based economy. So these are the types of things we can then say, all right, well, some of these things still seem to matter, and they more so seem to matter in inhibiting growth rather than in accelerating takeoff. Those two things might not be, are not always the same thing. Because what leads to takeoff, is often a combination of having certain features, and I think to some degree, this is where culture does play a role, but also really not having other features. So to get back to your question, this is also why we place institutions at a center, very central to the broader explanations. Again, it's just as much, if not more, for preventing takeoff as it is for accelerating it.
Mm-hmm. So one last question. What about
Sure.
the potential drawbacks to economic growth, such as pollution, climate change, the capacity to create deadly weapons? And I would like to ask you also specifically, if you think that economic inequality might also be a drawback of economic growth or not?
Sure. Great questions, and this is something again we're very cognizant of. That while we do think on the whole, economic growth has led to massive improvements in the quality of life of the average person. There are clearly drawbacks, and frankly, if we end up blowing up each other in a nuclear war that really is only possible due to economic growth and the kind of the scientific changes and political changes that happen because of it, it's all for naught. And I think more in some ways more directly, climate change is clearly the outcome of industrialization and all the various pollutants that come from come from engines, things like this. We'd also say, look, this is something that it has to be considered into the calculus of how we think about economic growth and how we think about persistent economic growth. We'd also say that the solution, particularly to something like climate change, I'd say less so to something like nuclear warfare, which is very much a political economy solution that's needed, which may or may not have anything to do with growth. Even though typically when economies are growing, they're much less likely, especially when they're rich, much less likely to engage in warfare. When we think about where the solutions for global warming and climate change are going to come from, we do think that economic growth will end up playing a role in this. So for instance, one of the big things by far that I did mention earlier that I think maybe is worth talking about just for a second here is as you get more and more people, especially in places like South Asia, sub-Saharan Africa, that are no longer worrying about the day-to-day. China's seen this, over 1 billion people move from abject poverty in our lifetime to something, again, it's not rich by, what we would say Western standards of rich, but something like $10,000 a year does allow for a certain level of comfort that you don't have when you're really on the edge of absolute disaster. As more and more of these minds are free to think of these solutions, it's much better to have 7 billion minds thinking, that are at least free to come up with a moment of genius than say 2 billion or less. That will be one way in which, alleviating the worst of poverty, that really allowing for growth to arise can help contribute to alleviating climate change. And also just in general, economic growth will allow for more investment in the types of technologies that frankly we've already been seeing in the wealthiest parts of the world. The US and UK, for instance, are both places where we've seen kind of massive changes in the way that energy is created in the last few decades, and really without any and I think one thing that we mentioned in the book that these things are not necessarily inconsistent with economic growth either. It's not that moving away from an oil-based economy leads to lower growth. In fact, it's actually being shown to be quite the opposite. And continued economic growth should help contribute to greater advances in the types of technologies that are needed to hopefully stop it in its tracks. The last thing you asked about was inequality. And on this, I think that there's two ways to think about inequality, and both are important. The first one was kind of intra-society inequality, so inequality within Portugal, within the United States. Mm-hmm. And this is something that, if anything, I think the most important reason to care about inequality, beyond just the fact that we want people around us to have the niceties of life, is that there are massive political ramifications. When we think about the long run economic implications of inequality, a lot of it feeds through politics. As you get greater inequality, you get much more. It's much more likely that you have populist leaders that typically are not great for further growth, that might also lead to greater conflict within societies, and conflict in the short run for sure is bad for almost everyone involved. So that's one of these margins on which, and it's also, I think, very clear that that pure economic growth that is not constrained does clearly lead to inequality. We should also say, though, when there's a certain level of inequality that's fine. Clearly, I think it's quite clear that purely communist systems did not work. Some type of incentive does matter. We should also say that that even though the degree of inequality has clearly risen certainly since the 1970s in most parts of the West, and had been high, say, prior to World War I, this is something where yes, there was higher inequality, but also, even the poorest people in society were much better off than their ancestors. This is true in Western Europe, North America, Japan, other wealthy countries, that even the relatively poor, say the people at the 10th percentile of income are significantly better off than people at the close to the top of the distribution, say 75, 100 years ago. Again, this doesn't necessarily justify it, and it doesn't justify distributions of income, but it's something to keep in mind that that if certain levels of inequality are an outcome of this process of economic growth, maybe it's worth it. Again, I'm not that's something that's much more of a normative question than I think anything. And I think the final thing to note on this is, I mentioned intra-country inequality. Mm-hmm. I like thinking of inequality more on a global level. Yeah. And I think that that's where we've actually seen less inequality over time, in that we've really seen a rise in the incomes of, say, the bottom 25% of the world. And on that front, I care so much more about, and again, this is normative in the sense of, I think people can certainly have a different opinion on this, and it's totally fine, because it's not really purely, it's based on my opinion, not based on
it's
on
research.
It's
more of a philosophical / ethical question.
Exactly.
Right.
Yeah, and I think that we've seen that the bottom part, say quarter of the world, a large fraction of that has seen the quality of life improve dramatically within our lifetimes, within, say, the last 40 years or so, in a way that, frankly, to me, justifies most of what we have had with economic growth. Again, does not justify climate change, rising nuclear tensions, things like this, because those things are extremely serious and actually certainly threaten to undermine everything. But on the other hand, when we think about something like certainly intra-country inequality, or and things like that are actually intra-country inequality and inter-country inequality are highly related. When you get stuff like outshoring of jobs from wealthy countries to places like Southeast Asia, mm-hmm. or China, for so long, that's something that can lead to a rise in inequality, as some decently paying manufacturing jobs leave wealthier countries, but it greatly increases the quality of life, even though, it might be from our perspective of, these people are making, $3 a day, or maybe more, more than that, $2 an hour, say, that would be something that in the U.S. would be looked at as oppressive, from a place where, people in the society were making $1 a day, now you're making $1 an hour. That's a big difference. And I mean, I think that that's something that, again, I in the ideal world, we move, even say $10,000 becomes an absolute minimum, per capita GDP that we view as acceptable. We're not there yet. And if we could even just get there, that would be such a dramatic improvement, relative to anything humankind has known, that, again, I think that it helps really, and I think it justifies why certain economists, and many economists, are so concerned with growth, is that we understand that it's not just about making the rich richer. In fact, it's not, for most of us, it's not about that at all. I don't really, I understand that might be a side effect of growth. In fact, it almost always is. But to the extent that, you're also in the process helping lift, people out of the worst of poverty, then that's really what I think really matters. And again, for me at least, when I think of inequality, that's the type of inequality that at least I care about the most.
Okay, great. So the book is again How the World Became Rich, the historical origins of economic growth. I'm leaving a link to it in the description box of this interview. And apart from the book, Dr. Rubin, would you like to tell people where they can find you and your work on the internet?
Sure. Yeah, I mean, certainly the book, is available, wherever you find your books, Amazon, of course, and others. Yeah, my website is www.jaredcrubin.com. Just, I'm sure if you give me a look up on Google or your desired web browser, you will find me. Yeah, besides that, I'm again, as you mentioned at the beginning, a professor of economics at Chapman University. It's located in Southern California, and I'm also president of the Association for the Study of Religion, Economics, and Culture, which is where most of my own research is located. It's asrec.org. And if, for those of you interested in that type of research, we have great conferences, great grad student events, and we'd love to see you all there.
Okay, great. I will be leaving also links to all of that in the description box of the interview.
Wonderful.
And look, I really loved the conversation, so thank you so much for taking the time to come on the show.
Thank you. It was a great conversation.
Hi guys, thank you for watching this interview until the end. If you like what I'm doing, please consider supporting me on Patreon or PayPal. You will find links to it in the description box of this interview. And also, please share the interview, leave a like, and hit the subscription button. This show is brought to you by Enlights Learning and Development Done Differently. Check their website at enlights.com. I would also like to give a huge thank you to my main patrons and PayPal supporters: Per Larsen, Jerry Mueller, Ernst Frederick Sunda, Bernardo Seixas, Olaf Alex, Jonathan Visser, Adam Castle, Matthew Whitting, Arno Wolf, Tim Hollis, Eric Alenius, John Connors, Philip Force Connolly, Robert Windager, Rui Inácio, Zup, Marco Neves, Colin Holbrook, Simon Columbus, Phil Kavanagh, Michael Stormir, Samuel Andreev, Francis Ford, Tiago Nunes, Alexander Dunbauer, Fergal Cusson, Hal Herzog, Nuno Machado, Jonathan Librant, João Linhares, Stanton T, Samuel Correa, Eric Hines, Mark Smith, João Eira, Tom Hummel, Sardas France, David Sloan Wilson, Yacila Dez Araújo, Romain Roach, Diego Londonho Correa, Yannick Punter, Adana Rusmani, Charlotte Bliss, Nicole Barbaro, Adam Hunt, Pablo Ostazewski, Nelek Bach, Guy Madison, Gary G. Hellman, Saima Afzal, Adrian Yegi, Nick Golden, Paulo Tolentino, João Barbosa, Julian Price, Edward Hall, Edin Bronner, Douglas Fry, Franca Bortolotti, Gabriel Panos Cortez, Ursula Litska, Scott, Zachary Fish, Tim Duffy, Sonny Smith, John Wiseman, Morton Eichland, Dr. Bird, Daniel Friedman, William Buckner, Mau Maria, Paul George Arnaud, Luke Gloaki, Georgios Theophanos, Chris Williamson, Peter Wolozin, David Williams, Ruth Towell, Diogo Costa, Anton Erickson, Charles Murray, Alex Shaw, Amari Martinez, Coralie Chevalier, Pedro Bonilla, Ziegler, Bangalore Atheists, Larry D. Lee Jr., Old Herringbone, Sterry, Michael Bailey, Dan Sperber, Robert Grassis, Tom Roth, DR PMD, Igor N., Jeff McMahon, Jake Zoll, Barnabas Radix, Mark Campbell, Richard Bowen, Thomas Dobner, Luke Neeson, and Chris Story. A special thanks to my producers Isa Webb, Jim Frank, Lucas Stafiniak, Tom Vanagdam, Bernard Ugni, Curtis Dixon, Benedict Mueller, Vega Giddy, Thomas Trumple, Catherine and Patrick Tobin, John Carlo Montenegro, Robert Lewis, and Alnick Ortiz, and to my executive producers Matthew Lavender, Sergio Codrean, and Bogdan Kanivets. Thank you for all.